Greetings, friends, and thanks for joining us again for another live at 3:45. These are typically Monday and Thursday, but I wanted to get David in, and our schedules were juggled a bit. And so I'm just delighted to have a colleague of mine with me, Dr. David Brown, a longtime colleague and a well-established American historian and author of several books on U.S. thought and culture. The Last American Aristocrat, I'm reading right now, which is on Henry Adams. I'm enjoying it as I was talking with David about that. Paradise Lost, The Life of F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Richard Hofstadter, An Intellectual Biography. And we'll talk with him currently about what he's writing on now, but the latter book on Hofstadter was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. His work is reviewed by many outlets, including the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, and more. I invited David especially to talk with us about, and we'll get to it, but the editor of the New Yorker recently wrote a little piece called The Wasting of the Evangelical Mind. And it caught my attention because Mark Knoll, who he cites often, was a historian at Wheaton College when I was there. And Mark has this quote, something to the effect that there is no mind to waste in evangelicalism because there's no mind there or something. And that's coming from an evangelical. So I asked David just to reflect broadly with us on what about the American experience lends itself to conspiracy theories in part, but particularly among those who are evangelical. And we'll get to that. But David, thank you for joining us. It's a delight to have you on the show.
It's good to be with you. It's good to be with all of you. Thank you.
So David, as I said to you earlier, I love talking with people who are good at their trade. And as I read through The Last Aristocrat, I realize how really very good you are at what you do. Why don't you talk a little bit about what The Last Aristocrat is about, what it covers, but also how you choose what you're working on now.
Sure. So The Last American Aristocrat is a kind of an intellectual biography of Henry Adams. He belongs to the famous Adams family. But I came to him really because of his ideas. He was born in 1838. He died in 1918. And by reading Adams, he wrote history, a very famous memoir, The Education of Henry Adams. He wrote a couple of novels. He wrote poetry. By reading the corpus of his works, one gets a pretty good idea about the process, the uneven process of modernity in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And so you can encounter Henry Adams in a history class, a literature class, maybe a sociology class. He is so encompassing. And so wanting to know more about American history is what first drew me into Henry Adams. I typically assign my students a chapter of The Education where he's referring to this process, the virgin and the dynamo, the way that things were, the virgin, the medieval period, unity as he sees it, and then the dynamo, the fragmentation of the modern capitalistic system and structure. He's kind of a romantic, but he cleaves to this notion of science, and he tries to construct categories in which we could understand what's been happening with Western modern civilization. So that's been something of a passion of mine for about a decade. I've been sort of playing around with that book. I've now become interested because of, not just American politics, but I think, politics in general, in the process of strongman leadership and of populism. And there's many ways to approach this. As an American historian, typically the way that the narrative begins in terms of a formal populistic structure is we look at the 1890s. We see the Populist Party, William Jennings Bryan, 1896 presidential campaign. And what I've done in my research and in some of my early writing on Jackson is to pinpoint this movement a bit further into the American past and to see Andrew Jackson, the first president to be born in a log cabin, the first president to reside west of the Appalachians, the first US president not to come from Virginia or Massachusetts, to embody a strain of American populism, which has really been there before, but never been structured, never been institutionalized. And it will come and it will go. It comes in the 1830s, it comes in the 1890s, and I think it's here with us today. So as an historian and looking to contextualize what I see around me historically, that's what has drawn me to this more recent project on Jackson.
And David, why don't you say a little bit about, we'll come back to this, what you just shared, but why don't you say a little bit about where you come from
Mhm.
and perhaps how it has impacted your approach to history?
Sure. So I come from rural Ohio. I grew up about 20 miles north of Dayton, and I'm a product of state schools. When I was young, my sisters and I, we attended a Quaker church. Um, Coming to Pennsylvania, I've been here for 24 years now for professional reasons. I feel fortunate to have a job at a place like Elizabethtown. I get to teach what I like to teach for the most part. I enjoy my colleagues. It's a pretty part of the country to live in. Having said that, I can't seem to shake the Midwestern person in me. And I very much miss, where I came from. And I go back when I can. Hence, it's been sort of a tough 10 years, or rather a tough 2020 with the COVID. I struggle a little bit with the private college because I attended state schools throughout, and the tuition and the cost of a private school is still something I kind of wrestle with a little bit. Um, I, I, I look for things in my past to kind of explain why I'm interested now in the things that I am interested in, Henry Adams, and frankly, it's a struggle and futility. The interests that I have now, I think, if I can tie them to my Ohio past, it's that I had professors who were pretty open-minded and would be willing to talk with me about lots of things, even if it wasn't always on the curriculum. And so they helped to, I think, spark intellectual curiosity on my part. And I'm grateful for that. What it is about my background that keeps me writing about Henry Adams or Andrew Jackson, I'm not quite sure, other than I feel coming out of a small PhD program and teaching at a small college, I haven't been forced to pigeonhole myself into teaching the same 3 classes over and over again and to writing within a narrow intellectual framework. I feel like I've been given a sort of a nice luxury or privilege to range somewhat broadly. And that's okay, because if you're wrong, people will definitely tell you about it, colleagues or reviewers. And that's what I really value, is the opportunity to write a biography of F. Scott Fitzgerald, even though I'm not in the English department, and to frame and think about Fitzgerald as a cultural historian of a kind, because that's how I read him, or to write about someone like Andrew Jackson, and to think broadly about American politics, American culture, and American life. I think that's what the education that I came from, I think that's what it fostered. And I think to an extent, I'm able to bring that into not just the classroom, but into my writings as well.
David, thank you for that. Although I'm not from the Midwest, we often, periodically, will talk about there's some similarities in our backgrounds. When I went to the Midwest from the mountains of Pennsylvania, I felt so free in the Midwest. And so I would probably have gone to the Midwest had said, I want to stay in Pennsylvania. But there's something about the landscape of the Midwest that I just found so freeing from this little parochial valley that I grew up in. Andrew Jackson was in the White House until the current administration, as I understand it. And so this goes to our question of what was it about Trump and Trumpism, the nationalism he promoted, that seemed to find its hook in American evangelicalism,
Sure.
or particularly white American evangelicalism. Can you talk to us about that, which goes to the heart of this editorial that I referenced?
Yeah. So I'm going to preface my remarks by saying I'm still very much a student on this, and I'm not an expert. So I'm finding my way to some of these some of the questions that you just raised. With the evangelicalism, this has been part of the Republican Party DNA for quite some time, at least the last 50 or 60 years. In fact, I mentioned William Jennings Bryan, and in 2006, there was a very good biography written of William Jennings Bryan by Michael Kazin. And Michael Kazin is very much on the left. And Kazin said, more than half serious, in the end of the book, he said, the Democratic Party, it needs, William Jennings Bryan again, it needs to find a believer. It's being portrayed as this party that's hostile to Christianity. And that is not a great recipe for the Democratic Party. So he was saying it needed to find its inner evangelicalism. So in an interesting way, the question that you're posing, I think, to what extent, has evangelicalism, maybe been, not so healthy for our politics. For those who don't have evangelicalism and see it such a strong percentage of Americans out there, they want some of it. They don't want to go the full route, perhaps, but they do want some of it. And it's a recognition that, even before Jerry Falwell in the early 1980s, with the Gospel Hour, evangelicals were attaching themselves to a Republican Party that was seen as being the party of an older type of American tradition. And we talk about culture wars today. This comes in part out of the culture wars of the 1950s and the 1960s. Post-war, desegregation, gender politics becoming increasingly important. One could go to Roe v. Wade in the early 1970s, the sense that the culture was shifting and that one had to make a choice. Either one was on the side of the progressive party, so-called progressive party, the Democrats, or one was on the side of the so-called anti-progressive Republican Party. And so, whereas before, you might have seen some evangelicals, in the Democratic Party, particularly the Democratic Party that will be associated with the 1930s, the New Deal social welfare programs that could provide jobs, assistance to organized labor. That was really being weaned in the 50s and the 60s. And then it became ossified, very hardened, I think, in the 1980s with what we begin to call the culture wars and political correctness. So I think that this is probably at least a 3-generational concern going. And the roots would go back even further into the past, as you noted, whether it's with the evangelicals of the 1820s and 1830s reacting to shifting market and economic circumstances, the market revolution, or even further back into our past, predating the American Revolution. This notion of frontierism, of evangelicalism, and identifying a political identity that one wants to associate oneself with. What we see today, it's an iteration, but it's nothing new. I think you might be muted.
So David, I talked with you earlier about, as Henry Adams comes from this Puritan background, but then largely disavows it, walks away from it. It was a Puritan context and religious context that had the mind, had an intellectual kind of thing going for it, but it didn't do particularly well in the American experiment. Why is that the case? Because even today, the main line, I was with a group of researchers, and the Episcopalian leader there was counting. He could actually tell us the day when the last Episcopalian is going to die. And the Baptists aren't talking that yet, or the evangelicals. So there's something happened here.
Yeah.
Why this distinction? Can you say more about that? You mentioned the frontier. Is this an American thing? Because the European scene is so very different in this regard.
America is a big country, and the evangelicals, or rather the Puritans that you mentioned, they were part of the problem in that when we began to see, as early as the 1650s and 60s and 70s, migrations out of the strict Boston diaspora, maybe not much of a surprise, but there were actually Puritan theologians who weren't interested in going off into the frontier and ministering to those people. But those people, they did want to be ministered to. And so you saw a very vibrant, itinerant culture crop up. Men who, horror of horrors, hadn't been perhaps trained at Harvard Theological Seminary. And so this is a process that's repeated in various ways over the years. So even when there is a sort of a Puritan diaspora out of New England into upstate New York, into the present-day Cleveland area of Ohio, the Western Reserve, oftentimes it's a population of believers, but it wasn't a population of clergy. And so historians have tended to call this the transition from Puritanism to Yankee. That is the process in which Puritanism, it goes from being really the dominant cultural expression to losing that force and that charisma and materialism. A Yankee, having money, commerce, business, begins to become an increasingly important thing. I'm not going to lay that all on the feet of the Puritan clergy and say, you know, that they didn't follow their flock like they maybe could have. That was part of the reason. One of my professors told me years ago that he thought that the errand into the wilderness, the Puritans coming to America, he said he thought that they came to the worst place. He said that they would have come to an island, social control, theological discourse and whatnot. It would have been easier to centralize and to control. But North America, it's a continent. And he thought that type of intellectual control was really just impossible. That over a couple generations, 2 or 3 generations, it would inevitably break down because more people would come. And of course, you know, what we know also is that, you know, it wasn't just the Puritans. Most who came to North America in the colonial period were actually enslaved, African, and indentured servants. Most of those indentured servants came to the Chesapeake, and that was the Anglican Church, but it was a much different religious expression. And when the Puritans tried to enforce a kind of a rigid cultural domination, which included the execution of 4 Quakers, they ran into problems because the Crown back home didn't like the idea of British subjects in North America killing British subjects in North America. So it imposed a degree of religious pluralism upon them, which now historians say, well, you know, it's great, but that also had the impact, the effect of breaking down a traditional, you know, Puritan approach. So the Puritans, they did have a Puritan mind, to be sure. They had a pronounced theology, an expression brought out by people like Jonathan Edwards and others, and it was used to sustain a civilization. And one could say that this went on for about 3 generations, but it was something that could not be maintained, perhaps not simply because it was an intellectual frame of mind or perspective that was that had to do with religion, but because intellectual life, intellectual culture in America has never really taken root or hold. What we say, or what you said about the Puritans is true. It's also been said about other groups who have come to America also. Why has so much of our intellectual culture, why has it been imported from other countries? And I'm thinking of the great diaspora of intellectuals, late 19th century, into the 1930s and 40s, scholars, intellectuals, artists leaving Europe because of fascism and what they have done here. It's been America has not been, I think, a country that has been favorable to ideas and a high idea culture, generally speaking.
And as I'm listening to you, you could add European theologians who
very much so
migrated here at the same time.
Well, as you know, because you know him as well as I did, when I came to college in the late 1990s, one of my colleagues was Bela Vasily, whose father was a noted Hungarian theologian, wanted by both the communists and the fascists. Bela's family, they came over during the war. I think they made their way through France and eventually came here. And I think his father taught at Princeton Seminary, and then Bela taught with us at Eton College.
So this lack of taking root, or this failure of the intellect to take root, doesn't seem to me to be unrelated to this question of the evangelical mind and the wasting of the evangelical mind and the openness to conspiracy theories, for example. So you've studied Hofstetter. Why is this the case? Why the openness to this? Why the lack of intellectual root? Why does this continue to get played out the way it does today?
Sure. So Hofstetter, who was also part of that migration, his father was an immigrant. And so he sort of was an insider and an outsider, and his perspective was interesting. He thought that anti-intellectualism very much had an evangelical strain to it. But not just that. He was also critical of the educational system. He thought that education, and he was writing this in the 1960s, had given away too much, for example, to collegiate athletics. He talked about other aspects of higher education. He thought that the business culture in our country, it tended to be anti-intellectual as well. In regard to the theological aspect of it, his great bête noire in the book was the evangelicalism of the early 19th century. When you had a transportation revolution and a market revolution, it broke down existing community structures, but people still craved for a religious life. They still had questions that they wanted answers to. They still wanted to believe in something more than just the transportation revolution, the latest macadamized road, or the latest canal being built, or the beginning of a railroad culture. So this flux was coming. And Hofstetter said it really uprooted a lot of lives. And people were looking for answers. And it was not organized religion that came in with the answers. It was the itinerants. It was the evangelicals. And they found great audiences. You go to a place like Rochester, sort of the epicenter of the movement for a market revolution. This was known as the burnt over district because the fires of evangelicalism had burned over the area. That was a contemporary phrase that was used. And so a historian in the 20th century wrote a book on the burnt over district. It's still a phrase that's tried out every now and then. I love it. It's very evocative. And Hofstetter said this burnt over district, it was a place that attracted all kinds of interesting spiritualists. It is the place where the Mormon religion began. It's where Smith was said to have found the great markers, the great stones. We know about that because the Mormon faith, it persisted, but there were hundreds of faiths which began in upstate New York in the Rochester Finger Lakes district. Most of them, they didn't last more than a few weeks or months or a couple of years, but it was a place where evangelicalism was rooted. People were looking for questions. That population moved into the Ohio, that population moved into other parts of the Midwest. It doesn't tell the full story, but it tells us that what I think evangelicals might be looking at today or might be questioning themselves about, there's a history here. And if we work off of Hofstetter, we might say it is the inability or perhaps unwillingness of institutionalized churches to go and meet their people everywhere, if that's even possible. It is the breakdown of traditional structures, economic structures, perhaps leading to the breakdown of cultural structures that brings about a sense of uncertainty and a desire to have certainty and to find that certainty. If the established church can do that, it will. If people can find that in an established church, they'll look in other places. They'll go online, they'll go to their neighbors, they'll look everywhere. They might even look to the materialism that is, to some extent, breaking down their situation. They might medicate themselves on materialism. So I think that what we see is something that we've probably seen before in this country, which is, on the surface, there are institutions, and we teach our children that these institutions are in control. But really, there's energy below the surface, and the energy is where people are finding answers, or at least enough of an answer to keep them coming back.
Wow, David, I keep talking to you for a while. That is, there's lots of sociology mixed in there. I mean, of course, it's history, but I won't take that from you. But just really fascinating to think about that, because I've been pretty critical of the kind of anti-intellectual nature of evangelicalism. But as I listen to you, I wonder, is this a religious problem or is this a cultural problem? Or maybe, how are these woven together? I don't know if you ever thought about that.
Well, that's a difficult one. I'm fairly ecumenical on this. There are things that I see in evangelical culture I'm not really excited about. I'm not a big fan of. But I think that people are sincere when they're searching. I think particularly when there are big questions, whether it's a pandemic or whether it's I'm going to lose my job, or how we're going to get along as a family or a neighborhood or a community. I think that those questions, I think they tend to be sincere, and I'd like to think that our political structure is strong enough, that our spiritual structure is strong enough, that our economic structure is strong enough, so that we can all together move in good faith and move together. But frankly, I don't see that. There are times in our history where I think we've had that more so than other times. I don't think we're there right now. And I think that these culture conflicts, these culture wars, I think it speaks to that, to the divisiveness. If we see a divisiveness in how Americans approach the church, I'd say it's an endemic divisiveness in a different context, but it's how we talk about economic issues, winners and losers. It's how we talk about political questions, winners and losers, and how we frame these things in a dynamic in which I'm not sure if this is just neoliberalism, but it's increasingly, it feels like it's less about community and about what either my particular tribe or me as an individual, what am I going to get out of this? That's probably not the best way to do it.
David, thank you. This has been terrific. I want to open it up to our guests and ask, does anyone have a question for David? I'm sure you've appreciated as much as I have what he's had to share. Anyone with a question or comment?
I think one of the concerns that I've had, having been part of the group that we're talking about today and having grown up under different teaching, is the inability or unwillingness to call out what seems obvious to people of heresy. And I guess, one of the things that, Jerry Falwell was a friend of my parent, or a guest at my parents' house twice when I was growing up. And he was one of the first to call out what he saw as heresy in the church. And I see a great reluctance to have done that with his son and what happened at the educational organization he was a part of. And I was wondering, do you see any hope for some sort of internal self-criticism and to actually call out people that seem like they're obviously on the wrong path?
I just don't know enough about the internal workings of the church and in that context to really, make I think a strong comment. I don't want to be too pessimistic. Generally speaking, I look at various power structures today, and I see some room for hope, but I'm not really convinced yet. I need to see more. And I think for me, it's also the question of what comes first, the chicken or the egg. What will push power to more responsible positions? Are we expecting leadership to do this on its own, simply because they're leaders, or do these people need to be nudged by the culture, by their audience? On a question of race, very recently, voting laws in Georgia, the question is, will they be changed or not? And I see corporations taking positions there, and I suspect it's probably because they're thinking about consumers and their audience and what their audiences want to see from them. So in terms of an institution like Liberty University and its relationship with the Falwells at this point in time, I'm curious, is that about the university leadership, or is that the university thinking that it's falling in line with what its customers want to see? I'm not sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Howes. One more question or comment? Well, this is definitely an episode worth listening to again and reflecting on some more and passing on. So feel free to do that. It will be posted on YouTube. It will be at my channel. It will also be on Facebook in a Facebook group. And David, thank you. This was delightful. And I'm going to continue to read Henry Adams and look forward to reading your next book as well as some of your past ones. So thank you to my colleague, David. You've been here 20 years,
24,
David?
actually.
24. So I'm 28, 28. So we're
That's right.
institutions here, just around the
Okay.
corner from each other. That's been a delight. You're a delightful colleague. Thank you so much, everybody, for being part of this. And welcome. We'll welcome another guest, a set of pastors who are talking about the pandemic and their experience of it on Thursday. So thank you all. Peace.
Thank you.